It was 2019. It was the year of the second annual conference of the International Society for the Study of Surrealism. And being 2019, it was the year after I completed this painting, Two Black Feathers Boxed Together. And it's the painting that I think of as marking my return to surrealism. I started out as a surrealist, an enthusiastic teenager surrealist in the 1990s. And somewhere in the 2010s, I started to explore other things. And then by 2018, I kind of came back to this as my core focus. And so I attended the Society conference presenting my research in surrealism and architecture. But while I was there on the final night, one of the surrealism scholars asked me a question that stuck with me for many years and is still to some extent with me today. She said, you know, Simon, everyone who's at this conference presenting, the 100 presenters that came to the conference, they all call themselves art historians, or maybe in general surrealism scholars, or students of French literature. But you alone in this group call yourself a surrealist, like you're still doing it, like it's still alive, like it's a living tradition. Why do you call yourself that? Or, you know, the question came to me like, what right do you have to call yourself a continuity of this tradition? And at the time, I was a bit struck by the question, but I had in mind Julian Levy's definition of surrealism. This is from his 1936 book on surrealism. And Julian Levy was a legendary surrealist and surrealist collector, surrealist gallerist. In 1936, the year that he wrote his book, he had exhibitions in his Manhattan gallery by Leonor Fini, Max Ernst, René Magritte, and Salvador Dali. It was a high point of surrealism in Manhattan. And in this book, he said, surrealism is not a rational, dogmatic, and consequently static theory of art. Hence, from a surrealist point of view, there can be no accurate definition or explanation. The surrealist point of view is essentially anti-definitive and anti-explanatory. The surrealist object precedes definition. And I'm like, I have surrealist objects, but it was a really kind of an unsatisfying answer, because it seems like the short way of saying it is, I'm surrealist because I say so. And when you're trying to convince academic art historians about your rationale, that doesn't sound very good. So the question's stuck with me, and I've spent a lot of the last 5 or 6 years trying to think up better answers, and partly to understand why it's so difficult to call yourself a surrealist. And so I'm going to come up with a series of answers for you based on these principles, but I'll start here with Sigmund Freud's notion of the unconscious, the most commonly understood seed of genesis for surrealism. So as Julian Levy said, surrealism's fundamental doctrine is that poetry originates in and appeals to the subconscious. So what surrealism's core claim is that, in a sense, everything is influenced by surrealism, including things that don't identify as surrealist. It's almost like my definition of art is that all art is a little bit surrealist. It's just whether or not how intentional it is or how clearly focused it is on those particular goals. One of the differences between literary art or mythical art or religious art or most 19th century and early art is that you need some kind of academic training or literary training to understand what the symbols of the artwork mean. But to understand surrealism, you just need to be a feeling and sensing human being, and it's trying to speak to your innate language. So to make more sense of this, let me explain, give you a diagram of Sigmund Freud's psychological theory of the unconscious. So we have 3 layers to your consciousness in Freud's version: the conscious, the preconscious, and the unconscious. And just as a side note here, Freud and Breton in translations would use the word unconscious, and others would use the word subconscious. So for example, Dali and Levy, following Pierre Janet, would use the word subconscious instead. It's somewhere you get confused on this point. I'm going to use them somewhat interchangeably because the shift in psychology between unconscious and subconscious, what Pierre Genet did with Sigmund Freud's work, would be a lecture on its own. Let's just take those things as kind of a granted continuum. So the conscious is of course, what you have in your conscious. Maybe you'd call it your psyche, those things that you're presently aware of. Those are the things that are conscious to you. And your pre-conscious is things that you're not presently aware of, but you can become presently aware of through the act of will. Like if I ask you what your address is, then your address comes to consciousness, but it wasn't conscious before, so we'd say we keep that in the pre-conscious. And beneath all of this is the unconscious or the subconscious, and it depends on who you ask, but generally we would say that those things are not available to access, fundamentally unavailable. And of course that breeds a whole series of theories which are like, how can we get access to the unconscious? And it might be, well, you can't by definition, and yet we are going to try to for a century. So we're looking at something that can't be seen fundamentally, which brings up one of the key confusion points of us expressing the ideas of the unconscious and the subconscious. But what I'm going to add to Freud's theory, my own development of his theory, though I say that because I'm somewhat ignorant of psychoanalytic theory, I should be able to tell you which people have thought this idea before me, but this is not my area of specialty. I'm going to argue that there is an upper and a lower part to the pre-conscious. Those things which are so close to your present awareness, you never think that you don't know them, and then maybe long forgotten memories, which you know are inside you somewhere, but you can't recall through an act of will. Or for those of you who know what it's like to try to remember something, you can set yourself the task of remembering something very specific from a very long time ago. You might have to wait a few days before the memory will come back to you, right? And maybe it takes years and maybe it never comes back. So I'm kind of arguing that there's a lower part to your pre-conscious. So within this, what I'm saying, generally speaking, is that your memories come from the pre-conscious and that possibly unrecognizable memories come from this place in the lower pre-conscious. And so when we speak and when we act, when we do things, we are motivated by the unconscious. It moves through the pre-conscious and maybe or maybe doesn't reach consciousness, right? Because you know that you can speak without being conscious of your speech. Doesn't usually happen, but it's possible. But also other forms of speech, it's really not deeply motivated. It's a lot of superficial talk, you know? So this is how we can act through this model. Now, dreams, to paraphrase Freud's perspective, it's the royal road to the unconscious. But it's not really a road to the unconscious, it's the road from the unconscious. We'd argue that dreams are the unconscious speaking to your conscious, and it speaks to you using the language of the pre-conscious. Right? So that when your unconscious needs to tell you things that it knows you don't understand, it needs to communicate with you in a way that of things that you don't understand. It needs to communicate a subject that you don't understand, but only using things that you do understand, which is why dreams are characteristically a lot of strange juxtapositions, things that don't normally belong together, these kind of expressions that we use on the dream signifier. And the notion here is that perhaps there is some good sense to dreams, it's just that we can't understand it. And so dreams arrive to us something like puzzles that we could solve, or maybe forms of spiritual development that we could pursue, or that there's something that we need to develop a way of recognizing in the world. So here's how experience works in this psychodynamics. So your experience occurs across the conscious and the pre-conscious and the unconscious. And when the experience ends, or whether it stops, whatever that event is, it kind of disappears. Like we'd call it like processed. If it's sufficiently normal an experience to be integrated into the pre-conscious, it can legitimately disappear. However, and then it becomes forgotten. However, when a traumatic experience occurs, and it goes into that position where it can be forgotten, it's not sufficiently well processed. And so it lives in the pre-conscious as a kind of a traumatic absence or a traumatic hole. We might say that falls to the bottom of the pre-conscious and you lose touch with this memory that you can no longer access. So what we'd say is that a traumatized personality has unconscious holes in their pre-conscious. And so when a dream speaks to you, it may well be using the language that's forgotten. So there's even less likelihood that you'll understand the nature of your dreams if they're interacting with the holes in your preconscious, giving you incomprehensible information. Or when you speak like a Freudian slip, you accidentally say the wrong thing and you hear yourself say something that is kind of a bit more true than you were intending. You think, oh, I know something about this information that I'm not aware of myself knowing. Right? Or you can act in those ways as well, of course. So what we'd say in general is that a traumatized personality, and remember in Freudian discourse, everybody's traumatized because birth is traumatizing, and a lot of things afterwards are as well. A traumatized personality has lots of unconscious pieces in their preconscious, or lots of holes in their preconscious. And so that when dreams push their information up through this channel, they may well be intersecting with multiple holes, leading to a kind of symbolic communication that you're in many ways unable to interpret, but really do belong quite concretely to the personality structure that you have. And in surrealist jargon, we would call these dream signifiers mysteries or enigmas. Now, you know, in René Magritte's literature, he would call this mysteries du jour, like it's a mystery of the day. So eventually you can figure out the meaning of these mysteries. But there are also mysteries de facto, those mysteries that can't ever be resolved, the more fundamental paradoxes of our life. So this language of there being a layer of information, and inside of that, through holes, we get glimpses of very different kinds of information, kinds of knowledge, as expressed by Magritte in images like this, the demon of perversity. It's even titled exactly the way this would make sense in Freudian psychodynamics, because those holes in your preconscious lead to a perversion of your activities, a perversion of your personality. Because you can say, I want to do something, and you try to do it, and something different happens. You know, very often we find ourselves acting against our own will, but that's because we can't control our will through our preconscious, because we don't know what's in our preconscious. And Dali would copy, as he often did, would admiringly imitate a lot of Magritte's ideas. For example, the enigma of desire, and in each one of those holes is written the word in French for my mother, as Dali's mother had died, I think about 6 years prior to this point, something like that. Now, in my paintings, in my surrealist paintings, in my earlier work, I would represent similar ideas, but through a language like this. So instead of showing holes as holes, you show what's visible through the holes. So we have the cloud, the man, and the turtle, and the water stacked on top of each other in a way that there's clearly a symbolic meaning, but what it represents is unknown. And that's, you know, it's clearly represented through the person hiding their eyes, but also like peeking just a little bit, you know, because who knows how much access we have to our preconscious. You can peek into it, right? Or when I was painting like mythical looking landscapes where there's traumatic aspects embedded in the image, but are very difficult to find. And maybe you can spend a long time looking at this image and think that it's all totally normal, just the way a traumatized personality does, right? In architectural theory, this idea was put forward by Anthony Vidler in the Architectural Uncanny, of just the simple diagram of the facade of a building, and recognizing that even though children draw windows as if they're transparent, for adults and in so-called visual real life, windows are black spots on the facade of a building. And inside of there is a hidden world that you don't have access to. So we have this clear sense of the front image and the deeper image, which is concealed through the operation of the architecture. Now, I've been working on these similar images of architectural holes, but to slightly different effects, thinking of a surrealist form of a pavilion. This is an example of the complex formal texturing that I'd like to develop for these vaults as a piece of it. And this is actually constructed as a full 3D model where each of the pieces has been calculated to be structurally load-bearing and something we can fabricate. And we fabricate this by cutting these blocks using a robotic arm, and we built these in the School of Architecture, Design and Planning at the University of Sydney. And those are the images which I imagine at that larger scale, made of bronze. But then again, that is only itself a fragment of some much larger project that we might do in the future. So let's take a hard cut and go to this series of events that were occurring before Surrealism emerged, say around 1919. If you go back into the decade before, we have the great figure of William Apollinaire, who's drawing by Picasso here. The highest form of cubism, according to Apollinaire, was called scientific cubism. The lesser form is physical cubism. But in scientific cubism, the aim was painting new structures out of elements borrowed not from the reality of sight, but from the reality of insight. And so you can see how there's a really similar philosophical aim to cubism as there was to surrealism. A lot of artists at this time were heading towards the same goals, trying to communicate knowledge rather than superficial understanding. So not scientific knowledge, but insight or wisdom or something that communicates a deeper truth than superficial appearance. That's also, I would say, one of the key forms of knowledge of classical art, is that classical art is based on the idea that you cannot trust the appearances of things, that truth appears through narrative and through knowledge, not through visual appearances. So while Picasso was developing this series of works, as it says here in the middle, Picasso, 1910, the port of Cadaqués. He visited the Spanish town of Cadaqués when Salvador Dali was living there. When Dali was 6 years old, Picasso came to visit. And something quite profound happened in Cadaqués, that Daniel Henri Kahnweiler, and that's Picasso's portrait of Kahnweiler on the right, wrote a book about Cubism called The Rise of Cubism. And in it, he talks about Picasso's visit to Cadaqués, which I'm sure that Dali and all the rest of the Surrealists knew. So out of my translation here, the great advance of Cadaqués was that instead of analytical description, the painter can, if he prefers, also create in this way a synthesis of the object, or in the words of Kant, put together the various conceptions and comprehend their variety in one perception. Now it is from here, from Kahnweiler, that we get that well-known distinction between analytic and synthetic cubism. But what's more interesting for us is the Surrealists' understanding of cubism. So here's a quote from Salvador Dali's 1932 essay, The Object as Revealed in Surrealist Experiment. He said that we became accustomed during the Cubist period to seeing things assume the most abstract and intellectual shapes. Lutes, pipes, jam pots, and bottles were seeking to take the form of the Kantian thing in itself, supposedly invisible behind quite recent disturbances in appearance and phenomena. So I know that's a little bit jargon-filled. I'll explain some of this to you, but it's worth noting that this is the way the Surrealists were discussing artwork. So let's explain the Kantian thing in itself so we can make sure we all grasp something along these lines. Now, my explanation will be incomplete because I only have so much time, but it'll be enough for us to understand what they're referencing here. Let's just imagine a person looking at an object, right? And so what you know when you look at an object is that you kind of have an image of that object in your mind, right? What I've tried to make clear here in this image is that the star is yellow on the outside and we can see the outside. So the star has yellow on the outside in the person's mind, but what's hidden on the inside of the star is different, because we know that we contribute to our perception quite a lot, but we try to take it for granted that there is some amount of actual information arriving to us. It's not an entirely psychological construction that we have inside of our minds. So in Kantian terms, what you have in your mind is the phenomena, and the object itself is the noumena. Now, even Kant didn't like the word noumena, so he kept calling it, in English translations, we call it the thing in itself. Right, so there's the phenomena, which is what you're experiencing, and the noumena, which is the thing kind of out there. There is some more to this, but that's the fundamentals here. So what Dali is saying is that Cubist things were seeking to take the form of the thing in itself. They weren't seeking to take the form of the phenomena, whereas Surrealist art and Dali's work in particular, he was seeking to represent phenomena, not represent noumena. Like, we have very little interest in the outside world. It's a study of inside. But then here's how he ends this point here. Supposedly invisible behind phenomena. Supposedly invisible. Is it really invisible? How invisible is noumena from us? And that is a key philosophical question that philosophers after Kant would debate for centuries. And it's still to some extent ongoing today. But this idea of there being some difference between the inside world and the outside world, but some relationship, gave rise to a series of surrealist motifs, most notably the veil, which really comes from Henri Bergson, who said that the difference between an artist and a normal person is that an artist has a thinner veil between themselves and reality. So we might say they're a highly sensitive person, or they have thinner boundaries, something like that, to use the Hartman boundary construct as a way of describing that, or to use the big five personalities dimensions, it would be a very high level of openness, like maybe too open, like some people are too open for their own good, right? And that leads to what schizophrenia at the extreme end, or schizotypal perhaps perspectives. There's a lot of debate around how we would classify these kinds of things, and that's not really the way the surrealists talk about it. That's just some more recent research on that point. So in my surrealist paintings after 2019, after 2018, I've been using a similar language of the veil between ourselves and other things. But instead of there just being a veiled object, there's a veiled object which you don't have access to. And it's almost like a decoy between you and the actual veiled object, which is in the box at the back, being attended to by a person who you can't see who it is. The kind of layers of distance between ourselves and the object. So that ultimately we're not sure, when we look at this, which is the object that is being veiled? And I think the decoy veil becomes a really interesting notion in surrealist theory. If people are looking for a veil in order to find out what's underneath it, maybe we can make them go look in the wrong place. As Magritte said, the painted veil veils nothing. A painted veil is paint. It's not veiling anything, but it prompts in you the desire to know what it's veiling. And that is one of the surrealist discoveries, that you can make people want something by showing them something is covered, even though they know there is nothing under there and it's just paint. That's prompting your unconscious urges. As Levi said, surrealism appeals to the unconscious, specifically to your desire to know. In other images, like the one from the invitation, as kind of objects which function as barriers or as gatekeepers towards the object in the background, or objects placed in some ways oddly out of reach or in precarious positions. So that's our Kantian section. So finally, this grows into the more difficult topic, which I would call the simulacra of surrealism. André Breton's Surrealist Manifesto was published in 1924, and the Art Gallery of New South Wales was planning an exhibition of Magritte's paintings to go across 2024 and 2025. And I know that Magritte would not have really been all that thrilled with the mass institutionalization of his work, because he was a bit punk, I think, a little bit of a rebel, a little bit Dada. He liked to find out whatever people were thinking, he liked to disrupt it somehow. And so I said to the curator of the exhibition that you need to have something surrealist in the exhibition, something that destabilizes the institutionalization that you're putting around it. And so I nominated myself to write a manifesto against this kind of phenomena and then have that in the exhibition. And I think both Nick and Yvette, Yvette said, that's mad. And Nick just looked at me like that's mad. And I went, challenge accepted. So I wrote my manifesto around this problem of the simulacra of surrealism. And I named it as a variation of Magritte's famous painting, of course. This is not surrealism. So this is the opening 2 paragraphs of the book. Surrealism will always be rightly associated with painted dreams. Some dreams are strange, psychedelic phantasmagoria, Others are regular life with a strange element, disrupting the ordinary. And some dreams they appear to be nothing more than just mundane life replayed. Okay. This observation about different dreams is an open space for a question. How would you know if a painting depicted a dreamscape? How would you know when you saw an image if it came from a dream or from reality? So if it was one of those stranger dreams, the dream painting could feature conspicuously strange dream elements, like a soft watch or a mountain made of clouds, a gigantic sunflower, someone peeling off a piece of the wall to reveal something strange in the background. But if it was not one of these ostensibly strange dreamscapes, how could a normal image convince you, or at least suggest to you, that its origin was a dream? Now, this is a key question, a key philosophical question of surrealism. How do you know if what you see is a dream? And my conjecture here is something like our psyche, more or less conscious awareness, it takes everything at face value. So if you just pick you up and drop you into a dream world, you just think that's what reality is when you're in it. Like, we don't walk around questioning the reality of life. And it's because we can't. You know, like if I think, oh, I can't step there because that floor might be an illusion, we become kind of imprisoned in this kind of strange fantasy. We are obliged in our life to take the reality for granted. And yet the fact that we take it for granted means there's a huge amount of unexamined information around us all the time. And there could be evidence to the contrary, but we would convince ourselves otherwise. So what we see in this question is that one of the features of our consciousness, of our psyche, is our absolute credulity to whatever you encounter. You just believe whatever happens to you. And of course, as you get older, you learn that not everyone can be trusted to always speak the complete truth about everything. But that takes some learning, you know, and very often we need to keep learning that as we age and we learn new forms of deception, the norm in various forms of communication that we encounter. So this question, to come back to this text here, in the context of the Simulacra of Surrealism, now, again, for a little bit of clarity, the Simulacra is a word that people struggle with, but I don't know a better word, and so I'm persisting with using it, like a few pieces of jargon that I use in my manifesto. This is one of the 3 key pieces of jargon. I think we need to become more familiar with these words, which is why I'm continuing to advocate them in spite of some degree of pushback. Like a simulacra means that something is similar, or there is a simulation, okay? So a simulacra of something is a kind of copy of it, but it's not like a mass-produced copy where they're trying to be identical. It's really like, say, that perhaps when you see the world, you see a simulacra of the world. Like if we took that philosophical step and said, you're not seeing me at the lectern, what you're seeing is what your eyes give to your brain. Okay, so your eyes take in the light, it's partially processed, and then you look at your own vision. And we know that to be at least certainly the case, because you can look at something and then just try to remember some place that you were on your last holiday. And you can keep looking at that object, but your attention is drawn away from the physical world into your inner mind, right? So it's not just the case that we always accept the outside world. We move between memory space and sensory space, we might say, to use again a version of Henri Bergson's language. So, in the context of the Simulacra of Surrealism Manifesto, this corresponds to a philosophical problem known as the verification of the simulacra. I guess one of the urges that I mentioned that Magritte discovered is that when you paint a veiled object, people want to know what's behind the veil, which is related to this idea. Once we know that there is some information out there, which is not the actual object, we have a drive to find out if what we know is true. And we see that in ourselves and in children all the time, right? People want to know what's true, even if at the end that knowledge is of no use to them. When there is deception or there is layering, for a lot of people, it's a great deal of fascination. I mean, the fact that, you can used to get like a DVD of a movie, and so many people would watch the behind the scenes, like how do they make the movies? Like we want to understand what it is that we see. And that's part of the verification of the simulacra. So To turn this back into the Kantian language that we had before, we have the phenomena and the noumena. But I want to add an additional piece to this puzzle, which I'm not sure Kant would like this, but that's fine. I want to move this step one bit forward and just say that you also are noumena, like you are noumena to yourself. When you perceive yourself, you don't see all of yourself. There are things in yourself hidden from yourself. And the phenomena is actually between two noumena. Like here I'm sliding towards Graham Harman's object-oriented ontology. It's an updated philosophical perspective that I share, but that would be a digression at this point. So when you have yourself and your phenomena and your noumena, I want you to imagine what it is that you have in your mind, which is everything that you know and think and feel about everything. Right? Like the world model that you have inside yourself. Like we all know that, you can imagine having a tennis ball in your hand and throwing it up and catching it, and you can kind of map that time and that movement completely in an imaginary space. But that's part of your world model. You've learned how long things take. You've learned the kinesthetics of where to move your arms. You have a large amount of the world in your mind. And most of the time we operate based on our knowledge of the world more than our sensory information about the world. Like if you're going somewhere, going on a 10-minute walk to a destination, you can kind of ignore most things that happen along the way. You just stick to your map and keep your destination in mind, and you're operating with reference to your own simulation of the world. And in surrealist theory, particularly the way Dali would put it, this is your simulacra. Now this is a challenging point because you have a simulacra and there is the simulacra. And the equivocation across those two is deliberate. Like we really have trouble knowing the difference between our world and the world. Because if I say I'm going to meet you at Balmoral Beach, I don't think to you that could mean anywhere in the world. I presume that our simulacra are aligned sufficiently, but they are independent of each other. So once you know that your mental model is a potentially flawed object and it needs to be continuously updated, it needs to be developed, we engage in the verification of the simulacra. We try to look at our simulacra as if it is an object. We try to look at the relationship between the actual world, if we can find it, and our simulacra. And we try to look at the world independent of our perceptions of it. Okay? So when you think about this, right, I am going to try to imagine my world model. Right? So I'm going to try to objectify my own mind and then look at that objectified world. So that becomes a noumena, and I have a phenomena of that noumena, which is to say, I always miss this slide. Every time I prepare this lecture, I always miss this exact same slide. Just to reiterate the earlier idea that we have conscious and unconscious registrations of our perceptions of things, including our own simulacra. There's the parts of the simulacra that we can see and those parts that we can't see. Maybe we could if we looked into it further. It is a complicated object. But what happens when we look at our simulacra, once we objectify our simulacra and observe it as phenomena, we have a simulacra within the simulacra. And this is where we get into that point where you realize that we are permanently stuck in a kind of paradox. Right? But this is, I think, one of the real paradoxes of life. Once we move into forms of self-observation, we end up with simulations modeling other simulations. And where is the oversight on these? Now, for Dali, particularly, these smaller simulacra, we would call new simulacra, as opposed to the old simulacra, these are the most corrosive things that we experience. And in a sense, we detest and we loathe the simulacra of the simulacra because we need to get away from those things. Because if every day you walk around thinking, well, I know that Balmoral Beach is that way, but who knows, like maybe my mind just made all this stuff up. It is, after all, entirely within me, and I'm trying to get somewhere in the physical world. And then again, I'm just thinking all of these thoughts, and I'm thinking those thoughts, and these are my thoughts, thinking those thoughts, thinking those thoughts, and we get into this infinite kind of regress, right? which is why it's necessary for us to go, no, I'm just going to tell myself that my vision of the world is the world. And we need to collapse this distinction, even though we know for a fact that that's not true. But we have to. And that is one of the really interesting parts about what surrealism is trying to, we're trying to wade into these waters. We'd like to swim in this ocean, but as soon as we get our feet wet, we're like, I gotta go home. That this is one of the really interesting parts that we're going to have to deal with. So the simulacra within the simulacra, that is the key subject for René Magritte's painting. The key subject, having went to the René Magritte exhibition more times than I remember, maybe 20 times I saw the Magritte show, including taking tours through there. And I think this is the key painting in his work. And you can see every time I mention these things, the titles point to the fact that I'm talking about. This is the human condition, which is the problem of the simulacra within the simulacra. And what you'll see when you look at this painting is your mind will start to tell you that's an actual landscape out there with a painted simulacra of the landscape. But it's not, right? It's two painted landscapes, which leads you to think that one of them is more real than another, right? But that's what you're contributing. Like, it's as if once we put an image on the wall, the image makes the rest of the world seem more real by comparison, right? That art makes the world more real, that it's not more real, it's less real. But that's the reversal that Magritte found so interesting and why he found these images so subversive. And we're kind of trapped within this simulacra paradox. Now, I would suggest, though I haven't seen evidence of this directly, that Magritte got this idea from Giorgio de Chirico, as he's cited de Chirico as one of his major influences many times, but only a handful of paintings that he referred to explicitly. And again, this is people looking at kind of a simplified, more abstracted view of the world within the world, kind of pointing to the reduction in information between the simulacra and the simulacra within the simulacra. Whereas what Magritte is saying is that the simulacra within the simulacra have the same degree of clarity and reality as the actual simulacra. And that's paraphrasing Dali observing Magritte's work. And that's the great advance, the deep corrosiveness of these kind of objects and these images. And Dali, of course, did the similar things, putting simulacra within the simulacra. Of course, his are these slightly horrific elements or traumatic elements. He said there's an overlap between the simulacral idea and the traumatized personality. And then in my own paintings, I have been working with similar thematic devices. Including one of my more recent paintings, it's a view of Sydney Harbour looking out towards Clark Island, and an image of an apocalyptic climate change catastrophe sitting on an easel, and a self-portrait, drinking coffee. And you can see that coffee is also holding me, the dual hands, just thinking about my next sip of coffee. Again, it's a simulacra of an ink drawing. It's just a painting trying to resemble an ink drawing. And I'm giving away the deconstruction of the initial simulacra, different to what Magritte were doing by deconstructing some of the world in which it sits rather than the images within. With a bit of loose bravura painting and little perspectival shifts in the easel to show that that's not real, which is in a sense to argue that the simulacra within the simulacra is maybe more real than the simulacra. That strikes me as funny. So, and more recently than that, I've been working on a series of related images of similar things. The idea that we have the idea of the house and of domesticity, and whether that's the dream of owning property for some people, or the family as a peaceful environment, which sometimes it's not, and the dual presentation of building facades, given the darkness of what is inside, and the difference we have between public space and private space, all these strange paradoxes built into our culture. Like just for example, one of the old heuristics we used to have around this is that you're often told when you're young that home is the safe place and there's dangerous things out there in the world. But you're in a culture like Australia, you're more likely to have a problem at home than outside of home. Right? And so there's the inversion of the meaning of things, or whether or not you would say both things have equal meaning even though they're opposites. So I'd been obsessed by this image for a number of years. I made some early sketches of it, and I just couldn't convince myself to paint it. I thought nobody would like it, and it's like when I laugh that the simulacra within the simulacra is more real than the simulacra, to me that's a joke, and that's not everybody gets that joke. So I just painted this painting for myself, and I put it on the wall in my bedroom, and it stayed there for a few months. And then last year we went with the Art Gallery of New South Wales. We did an international study tour to Spain, and we visited all Dali's sites and all the great museums around Spain. And literally when I came back that day, I just sat on the bed and lay there and looked at the painting, and in an instant I imagined that painting painted onto an egg. And so I painted that in response to that vision. I couldn't finish this painting. Well, it finished it for months, and I kept feeling drawn that I needed to put another barrier between you and the image. So I painted the wire between the two bollards to prevent you from getting access, and repeated the same barrier in the updated version. It's that same notion of the Kantian distance which binds all these things together. Now, as my final point, and my second of the 3 pieces of jargon in my manifesto I'd like to share with you, comes from René Magritte's legendary painting, The Treachery of Images, or the treason of images, perhaps, depends on how you translate that French word. And as I presume we know, it's just the French for "this is not a pipe." And so we have to work out how are we to understand this. Is "this is not a pipe," what is this referring to? Is the text not a pipe? That's pretty obvious. Is the painting not a pipe? Well, the painting's a painting. Is the painting of a pipe not a pipe? Right? So we know there's a relationship here, but it's really hard to put a finger on what is pointing to. Right? Now, for me, this was the key image of understanding Magritte, and that's what I used through my manifesto, This is Not a Surrealism. And the key term I want to introduce to you, and I'm trying to bring to the world, and there's a great Australian philosopher called Graham Priest who talks about this a lot, called Dialetheism, which is a hard word to say, just like simulacra can be a hard word to say, but I feel like we need a way of describing these things. Dialetheism is the belief that there are some true statements whose negations are also true. That's why I feel like we need a word like this. When someone says, "I heard someone on the news, some politician said something, was that true or not true?" And I think that's the wrong question. We need to understand that a lot of things that people say aren't true or untrue. They're something else. Of course, they're both of those things at once, but they're actually something else entirely. And that they're referring to something. They're kind of statements that engage with the simulacra itself rather than with the world. Or they're statements made to change your preconscious, not to change the world, but to change the way you see things. These can be quite insightful statements, except the insight isn't visible on the surface. Like this painting here, Magritte's painting, it is a kind of a superficial, shallow thing. But at the same time, it's pointing to something that's so deep we can't really get our fingers onto it. I would call this one of the really slippery objects. So in the manifesto, I made a series of images of people encountering the dialethic object, which takes the form of Magritte's painting. So we see here a person looking at the painting, but that seems to generate a sculpture of themselves, looking down on themselves, looking at the painting. Or the painting appearing as a new growth, in a monumental form. Or here, my animated version of some Mariological confusion as people try to understand the painting, and as they approach the simulacra, the contents of the world changes around them. And that's what the surrealist object should do. It should change reality. As Magritte said, the purpose of surrealism is to make life worth living. It's to inspire one towards life. So that returns us then to the question that I was asked at the University of Exeter over here in Reed Hall. Why do I think I can call myself a surrealist at this late point in history? And once we understand the notion that there are some statements whose negations are also true, then we're almost there, aren't we? So here are the three things that I've been discussing today. What this turns into. The three main reasons I would say that it's so difficult to describe surrealism, why it's so easy to misinterpret surrealism, is that because in the beginning it contends with the unknown and things which are arguably unknowable. And yet in order to identify with it, we need to turn it into some form of knowledge, which takes away the authenticity. And it's grounded in Kantian notions of philosophical concealment, where veils and distance between ourselves and the truth are what is fundamental about everyone's experience of life. Finally, that through the simulacra, these philosophical barriers between us and real life place us inside of paradoxes, where we know that our language is insufficient to describe actually what we experience. But my contention is that these can be clarified only through contending with surrealist dialetheia, which means increasing our understanding of the world that we live in as including objects that are inherently and permanently paradoxical, but yet stable in that form. Like the simulacra within the simulacra within the simulacra, that itself is something. And the treachery of images, the pipe, and this is not a pipe, together that is something. It's like an argument in progress. It's like an engine that's always running. So, why is surrealism so slippery? So now, I hope you know what I mean when I say that this is not a surrealism, but it's a manifesto for and against simulacra of surrealism. Thank you for your attention, everybody. I hope you enjoyed.